Uh, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the CSTO problem. First of all, we would like to express our gratitude to the Field Institute and the organizer Matthews, Alan, William, Angus for involving on this fantastic diversified group for solving some time-demanding problem in this current context. We are also thankful to our mentor and advisors of this group. Jan and Kyle are from the industry who initially raised the problems and acted as a mentor in our group. And William Weijie is an advisor to our group. And we have a fantastic 5 members in our group: me, Aftab, Florian, Davide, Oktay, and Weijie. So why we all know him in these pictures, Wayne Godley, why he is here. One of such economists who was able to accurately predict the financial crisis and who promoted the uses of sectoral balances to map the economy. The models he created were called it as stock flow consistent model. So why he appeared in our first slide? Because the core methodology or the benchmark model of solving our problems is only adapting some 7 unsustainable process of Godley's and SFC models. Our whole presentation is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 is about the CSTO problem. Part 2 about the methodology. Here we will discuss about the 7 unsustainable process, SFC models, some econometric studies. Part 3 about the 3 apps and some scenario analysis. And part 4 is about the conclusion, the summary of our whole analysis, what we got from the extensive 3-week workshop. And further, we are all interested in carrying out or move forward to solve this problem in some extensive manners and probably for some future publications. Thanks to Matthews. Part 1, CSTO problem. In this problem statement, the global economic stimulus responses to the COVID crisis and some unintended consequences such as asset price bubbles, cross-border volatility, and financial tsunami. And we all know that before the COVID crisis, we have already facing some issues. For example, easy monetary policy, instability in the financial market across the globe, and the excessive global debt and its poor quality. Now, along with these problems, we have COVID now, and where a huge amount of money growth has been appeared because of some fiscal stimulus and quantitative easing or some easy monetary policy across the world. And this excessive flow of money has raised the following issues of the volatility of the cross-border capital flow, asset inflation, the risks of financial tsunami, especially for countries with a small open economies like Canada. Okay, Canada, small open economy where we have been, we are, a small open economy like Canada actually we are trying to find the pathway of the questions here that what are the specific vulnerabilities of Canada to international capital flows? How does Canada's own internal economic structure and international position fare given the domestic and international fiscal responses to COVID? We are going to address these issues by considering housing market, sectoral imbalances of Canada, as well as the financial system of the Canada in our empirical analysis part. And the third part is about which internal or external imbalances or divergence given Canada's industrial and financial structure present the greatest weakness in the face of financial tsunami. And we have a little bit discussions in our very last part of our slide about international monetary policy and the potential increase of interest rate. Part 2 is about the methodology, and here we are going to discuss about 7UP, SFC, and econometric studies. 7UP, we all know when God is and if the quotations from Owen Godey's 7 Unsustainable Process, a sensational day of reckoning, and we don't want that particular day. We will try to avoid this day by providing some insights from our problem. Godey's famously used the flow of fund accounts to analyze the turbulence phase of the United States. The context of that sustainable process that Godey's proposed is that the restrictive fiscal policy, the rise in the private expenditure relative to income, sluggish net export demand, stock market to an unusual extent. So on the basis of this context, he argues that the progress of United States in 1999 is not sustainable, and these 7 unsustainable processes are the fall in private savings, rise in the flow of net lending, rise in the growth rate of the real money stock, rise in asset price, rise in the budget surplus, rise in the current account balance, and increase in the United States net foreign indebtedness relative to GDP. And from these particular 7 unsustainable processes, the remarkable and most useful factors are actually the net flow of lending to the private sector, the growth rate of money stock, asset price, and consistent current account deficit in Canada's perspective. And here is a simple examples of Canadian economy, the national net savings. We can see that in the last part of this graph is that there is a huge decline of net savings in the early of COVID crisis, and it just bounced back. The bounce back because of the increased amount of household savings. Because of strict lockdown policy. Maybe these are the forced savings come from the household sectors. The logic of divergence, I also already discussed some of the issues of this, what are the purpose of Godey's. Godey's argues the economic trajectory of the United States in 1999 is unsustainable. And the most important point I would like to mention here that the instability occurs when the system grows in a way which doesn't keep relative balance stable. What about this 7 unsustainable process in today's conditions? This 7 unsustainable process describe a world prior to the financial crisis, where the process are building up to a crisis. Now, post-crisis, how do we adapt this logic actually? Today, we have a world of high debt and low interest rate, economic stagnation, widespread distressed balance sheet, asset prices strained by quantitative easing and easy monetary policy, and definitely we have now COVID situations. And how we adapt this 7 unsustainable process to the CS2 problems. So from this 7 unsustainable process, we identify some key topics that are good fit to our problem. These are asset price and housing, debt, household and government, trade imbalances, capital flow, perspective to Canada, and definitely CS2 problems is mainly focused on how monetary policy affects the housing price and debt in the market. So that's all from me. From here, Florian will take over the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, so to tackle our problem, we decided to focus on an SFC model, ABM-SFC modeling approach. And yeah, although improvements enhance the realism of standard DSGE models, we argue that major drawbacks still undermine their reliability. DSGE models still fail to recognize the complex adaptive nature of economic systems and implications of money endogeneity. We therefore argue that coherent and exhaustive representation of interlinkages between real and financial sides of the economy that also underlie the aforementioned 7 unsustainable processes should be a pivotal feature of every macroeconomic model, and therefore propose a framework based on the combination of the agent-based and stock flow consistent approaches. The SFC approach has its origins in the work of the Yale group around James Tobin and the Cambridge Economic Policy group of Weijie and Godley that used stock flow consistent structures to analyze the US and UK economy in the 1970s and 80s. The roots, however, can be traced back to 1949 and the work of Copeland. So current SFC models emerged from the post-Keynesian tradition, with Godley delivering seminal contributions and arguing that the wider adoption of SFC models would improve transparency and logical coherence of most macro models. As mentioned before, the most important feature of SFC models is to integrate the real economy with the financial side of the economy. So SFC models are used as a general framework to address complex topics via the incorporation of additional theme-specific building blocks. And this strategy is based on a combination of knowledge coming from different fields of research. Minsky described this quite well in saying that the structure of an economic model that is relevant for a capitalist economy needs to include the interrelated balance sheets and income statements of the units of the economy. So crucially, SFC models integrate money seen as a flow with money seen as a stock. And we can say that these models are a specific kind of post-Keynesian macro model that follow distinctive accounting rules, ensuring the consistent integration of the stocks and flows of all sectors of the economy. This basically led to 3 important achievements. First, the consistency of the overall economy, since one sector's outflow is always another sector's inflow, and just as one sector's liability is always another sector's asset. So second, the integration of the real and the financial side of the economy. And third, the construction of the long run as a chain of the short run. Basically, nothing is lost in these models, neither in space nor time. And broadly speaking, we can identify 2 main components: the accounting framework and the behavioral equations. So the accounting framework usually relies on a set of matrices reproducing the balance sheets, transactions, and capital gains of each of the institutional sectors into which the economy is subdivided. The second component is a set of behavioral equations modeling all the transactions not directly determined by the accounting structure of the economy, so that the accounting represents the framework, which then becomes a post-Keynesian model once the behavioral equations come into play. The integrated treatment of the financial and the real sectors provides a natural way to examine issues related to financial fragility and its links to the real economy. It's therefore no coincidence that Minsky's work has been very influential on the SFC literature. And we can identify 4 main accounting principles of the SFC modeling. That's the flow consistency, stock consistency, and stock flow consistency. I won't go into the details here, but from these 3 principles follows a fourth, the quadruple entry, which means that every transaction involves a quadruple entry in accounting. For example, when a household purchases a product from a firm, the accounting registers an increase in the revenues of the firm and the expenditure of the household, and at the same time a decrease in at least one asset of the household, and correspondingly an increase in at least one asset of the firm, or vice versa. Underlying is the motivation here that SFC models are the likely locus of some of post-Keynesian consensus in macroeconomics, as it allows to entertain both monetary and real issues within a single model by dealing both with tangible and financial capital. And Weijie will now take over and argue further that a coherent and exhaustive representation of the economy should be in focus, and therefore proposes our chosen framework based on the combination of the agent-based and the stock flow consistent approach that I just presented.
Yeah, thank you for the Florian's introduction. So we know like the major component of this SFC model is this four component that the households, the financial institutions, the firms, and the public sections generally mean the government. However, if we only focus this four, they will actually ignore many differences among each of the components. Although there are some papers or researchers divided on the like financial institutions to like bank and the central bank, but they still ignore the heterogeneity of the agents. So we know like actually for the different forms, the customers can compare the products and they will have the competitions within the market. And also for all of the countries, actually they will have the open economics to the other countries. So this means they have the geographic space requirement for our SFC models. So we should including the cross boundary trees and investment into the typical SFC model. And moreover, for the banking, they actually have the interbank liabilities and assets. So it will be automatically direction to think about the network-based balance sheet between this banking system. And the last also we have the organization of the industries, like some forms of banks will default and the flows of capitals will be owned by some other banks. So based on this requirement, actually it will be really automatic for us to think about construct agent-based SFC model. So to do this, actually we want to include in the following consideration to our model. So for example, the first is about the pricing competitions between the products. And also for the banking, like when they try to attract the deposit, they maybe have a diverse interest rate. And this will also important to include. And also the interbank liability. And also for the household, they will have to select their majors by the weight. And also they can be decided which bank they want to saving money by driving by the different interest rate. And also the last is a bankruptcy of the firm and firms and banks. So although we haven't finished the modeling, but there is several interesting we want to work on in the following months or after this workshop. So the first thing is about the financial sector balance sheets, balance in the national economy. So for example, this including the government fiscal, the foreigner financial, and the private financials. And also it will be interesting to integrate the like shadow banking into the models. So besides the typical banking and central banks, the shadow banking is also a huge amount of our system. So it's interesting including this. And also about the financializations and also the, if we can focus after we construct the model. So it's interesting to focus on what will be happen or be affect to Canada's based on some shock from the cross boundary, and also similar about the open economic framework. So we try help with the agent-based SFC model. We can really build a model with no black hole in the stock and the flow. So before we move to the next empirical work to explain like why the previous topics is interesting and important. So here is a quick summary about what the typical economic approach to some unintended consequence. So for the asset pricing, inflations, cross-boundary flows, and financial tsunamis, so they already have several statistic methods to solve of them. So here I won't mention detail of them, but this is also some typical method to analyze this question. So part 3 is about empirical work. So Oktay and David will take over this part.
Okay, thank you, Weijie. In this section, I present the identities. I present the sectoral balances and some scenarios about the economic intervention of Canadian economy, Canadian government, and central banks. So you see that you know these identities, right? These are basically national accounting identities. The sum of these three balances has to be 0, right? So then you see that the sectoral balances of the Canadian economy during the COVID-19 crisis, there is huge volatility in the balance sheet, right? As you see, there is huge decline in the government balance and the huge increase in the households as a saving, right? So then this is standard national accounting matrix, which is the starting point of SFC models, and it involves the 3 main agents: households, businesses, and governments. So sum of these 3, sum of the each row has to be equal to 0 by definition, right? So let me try to explain the 3 main balances of the Canadian economy. So the first one is the trade balance. So you see always that something was changed in the beginning of the 2008 crisis, financial crisis for the Canadian economy, right? So after the crisis, Canadian economy has continued to have large current account deficit. So question we need to ask here is these processes, this large current account deficit, are sustainable for Canadian economy or not? So this is important, I think. In the next one, the second one, you know, this is the private balance, which is investment saving minus investment. It represents the private sector balance. So we derive this data from the current and capital accounts in StatCan databases. You see that on the right hand side, pay attention to the right hand side, graph in the right hand side. So there is an incremental trend in the capital formation as sketched as the blue line. On the other hand, there is a fluctuation occurs in the saving rate, net saving rate over the years. So there is a decline in the saving rate, especially after the 2013, right? Now to pay attention to the right hand side. So this blue line is the difference between saving and investment. So especially after 2013, you see the negative values means debt, by the way. It means the liability side of the sectors. So it is, by the way, accounting by the changing debt structure. So this might be also maybe the signal to some need to capital inflows. So then the next one, in this chart, you see that the saving rate is illustrated. So during the COVID-19 crisis, household saving rate is significantly increased, as you see. So then the important point in here, we need to look at the volatility of the velocity of the money. So this can be understood as the previous point can be understood also. The behavior of the household can be understood also velocity of money. Look at the end of the line, which is the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. There's huge drop in the velocity of money. There is also in the last 2 decades for Canadian economy, there has the declining trend. In our idea, this means that I think the money supply is going to cause great asset price inflation. This is important, I think. And the next one, this is last one, is the government balance. It seems that Canadian economy, on the right-hand side graph, the Canadian economy Canadian government follows the budget balance policy, except for the period between 2008 and 2014 and the post-COVID period, right? There is huge decline in the government balance. So on the right-hand side, you see during the COVID-19 crisis, the federal debt are significantly increased, right? Due to that the central bank purchased the government bonds and it increased their expenditure, right? So first, remember the large current account deficit and the difference between the private saving and investment after especially 2013. So in the system, there has to be some inflows to finance this deficit, right? So you see that the net financial accounts, below the zero, it means that the liability side. So after the financial crisis, especially, there is a capital inflows over the portfolio investments, some government debt instruments, some securities, as you see. So then let us explain some scenarios of the economic intervention of Canadian government and central bank. We explore all these causal relationship between the sectors by using the balance sheets. So to understand this complex system, first thing you have to do is to understand the structure of the system, right? Institutional structure, right? In the next one, you see that this is an economy as a whole. You see the 5 main agents that govern the whole economy. This is also, by the way, economic situation which when the COVID-19 begins. In the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, you know, the uncertainty was significantly increased. So households began to save more and consume less. As we see in the balance sheet, right? The saving rates of households was significantly increased. So on the other hand, this uncertainty causes that the firms also reduce immediately their capacity utilization. This means also unemployment rate, right? So that is the amount of wages in the economy was reduced also, right? This is basic situation when the COVID-19 crisis began, okay? By the way, in my idea, this crisis, I think, if you think the large lockdowns and closures of the firms, so this is, I think, the largely demand shock, right? So when we also observing that the central banks immediately intervene the system by using the 2 important tools, right? The first one is the sharp interest rate cuts. The second one is the open market operation. It purchased government bonds and securities to support the system, right? So, by the way, follow the lines, right? It is really simple. So, due to the sharp interest rate cuts, the credit mechanism was accelerated in each country. Whenever you look at the credits expansion of the countries, you see the same trends, right? Every central bank intervened, and some of them purchased some government bonds to finance government's expenditure, and there's some other tools, open market operation, etc. If we observe this sharp interest rate cuts, credit mechanism was accelerated, and these cheap credits can be demanded to agents, the firms and households, right? So if we observe in the future, the large increase increase in the household credit, especially in the mortgages, collateral mortgages credits. So this will be very big problem for Canadian economy, because households have already large portions of deposits, right? Their saving rates was already increased. So if they have to access the large credit, cheap credit, this will be very big problem. So you in the future you have to pretend this attempt, I think. And the next one. And the second scenario, the fiscal policy, right? We observe the fiscal policy of the governments, right? So, and the next one, this is, by the way, similar with the previous one. This is the beginning of the crisis. So there is huge decline in the consumption and employment. So we observe that government increased their spending, their expenditure, by using some direct payment check, especially in the US. It is also happening in the Canadian economy. So there is also DOL, which is automatic stabilizer. As the unemployment increase, the DOL payments also has to be increased, right? So in order to understand the intervention of the government, so first you look at the consumption case. So the firms have a lack of demand, so governments support the system to increase the aggregate demand, the recover to the consumption, right? So firms produce to sell their commodities, and then the wages will recover to this expansion. But important point in here, so if this expansion calls to some possibilities that the household tend to consume more mortgages, this will be also a very big problem. So you can tax this money. You have to tax this money in the future. So another case in the firm side, right? So the central bank advances cause to asset price inflation, because this repo agreement is consisting of some mortgage securities. This causes also the effect from the firm side. So you have to tax this money, right? So otherwise there will be very big problem. So for example, that is why Biden's plan to the tax to reach, right? So there is two bubble in the economy. First side in the asset prices, second side in the real estate market. We know also, right, this expansion, these QEs cause asset price inflation. So rich get richer, and income distribution is working, etc. You will have to tax these money and withdraw some portion of money from the circulation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oktay. So I'm going to build up on this. This is quite a gloomy title, I'd say, but the idea is that I'm going to try to give you a short, let's say, glimpse into the Canadian economy with respect to money stock and specifically debt for what concerns the private households, and asset prices as a byproduct of that, and specifically housing prices. So the Canadian economy has quite a peculiar situation in the sense that has always had quite high level of debt, and specifically household debt. And as some of you may know, has quite a booming housing market. So for instance, the BIS and the ECB has devised some early warning indicators, which are variables which are basically try to detect which variables correlate the best with banking crisis, right, as early warning indicators indeed. And the most important ones that they found are credit to GDP and debt services ratios, among many. And the Canadian economy has always scored quite high, even though, interestingly, never really had a major banking crisis itself, right? So the question is, are we on the path towards that? This debt has been building up, as I'm going to show in a minute, for 15 years or so. So the question is the new monetary policy word is going to be a sort of catalyst for potential crisis. And so here is a snapshot from the governor of Canada, who's recently, a couple of days ago, reported that while the resulting house price increases are rooted in fundamentals, we're seeing some signs of extrapolative expectation and speculative behavior, basically raising some concern over the housing market. Just I'm gonna to introduce the debt in Canada. You can see that Canada, which is on the top right, is the red line, had quite an interesting trend compared to other countries in the sense that has always had this sort of steady increase. And even the countries which, by the way, are the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, which have always been characterized by high level of household debt, had a peak before the financial crisis and eventually started reverting back. Canada never had this, right? And it's very different also compared to the United States, for instance. And the other variable, which I mentioned before, is credit to GDP. And I'm going to unpack more on this in a minute. It's plotted here on the top, on the bottom left. And we see already a nice parallel between the financial crisis, where you had this peak in credit to GDP, which is basically what we also are where it seems that we're seeing now. So the question is, what's going to happen next? Is this trend going to become more linear? It's going to explode? It's going to revert back? And the question really is, how important is credit to GDP? How unsustainable can it be? And before moving to that, I'm going to give you a little glimpse into housing, because basically the question is, where is this credit going, right? And then on the top, you can see nominal house prices, which are quite high, but not very, very different from those of the Euro area or the United States. But the interesting variables here are those which sort of reflect the impact that mortgages and housing can have on households, right? And this can sort of be encapsulated in price to rent, but more specifically in price to income, which I think is quite interesting because Canada, for quite some time, from 2015 until 2019, was the highest country with this ratio. And now just recently had a lower level, but even though it's really quite high. And just to move forward a bit, this was a recent report by the Bank of Canada, which gave an update on the housing and the debt levels. And on the top right, you can see that households quite, like you can expect, these are accumulating more debt, but actually this is mortgage credit. It's mortgage debt, right? And another interesting thing is bottom left, is that this debt, this mortgage, are being taken mostly by those households which have very high loan to income ratios. And this, as I'm gonna argue in a minute, might pose some real problem, because one can argue that these households are those which might be affected the most if something changed in the let's say in the policy structure. So where can the unsustainability be, right? So the first question I wanted to pose, as I said before, is how much credit is too much, right? And here on the bottom right, it's a graph, which basically what it's saying is, you have credit, and this credit can go in two ways, right? So it can go to finance the real economy and increase GDP, for instance, which is basically what most of the macroeconomic models think as debt and credit, which is just using to finance investment positions, for instance. But also you have another flow, which is actually the credit which goes to finance the financial sector and property sectors, right? So the question is, how sustainable is this? The sort of $1 million answer is, it depends how much of this credit is actually inflating in these assets. But actually, when it comes to modeling, also what I said before, credit to GDP ratio, right? Interesting variable, but it's a stock. Doesn't really tell you much about the flow of where is this money going, right? So here is also, we have some nice parallel with the stock flow consistent model, in the sense that in the stock flow consistent model, this sort of behavior should be encapsulated somehow. So this is just to give you an idea of why is credit important and to study it. And the other sort of unsustainability processes might perhaps be in debt, which are too high, as Godley used to point out, which might lead to debt traps. And of course, if that goes on inflating housing and asset prices, this can become bubbles, and we know bubbles might have when they go burst can have an impact on the real economy. And sort of intertwined with all of these points is the fact that these debts and these mortgages are being taken quite a lot by these most vulnerable part of society, which are those which want something change, perhaps mortgage rates increase suddenly, perhaps, or inflation or interest rate rise. These are the people that might not be able to afford new interest instruments. So how do we model this? As I said, it's very hard for us because we don't have data on previous crises for Canada specifically. So it's very hard, for instance, to go for a standard Logic model, for instance, with some variables and the probability of defaulting or not. So we think that the SVC model is one of the best models that we can try to aim for, also because we can test scenarios, right, of future increase in interest rates or mortgage rates, for instance. The real issue also, as Weijie pointed out, is shadow banking. Shadow banking, it's really hard to get data on. And one can argue that in this case, this is where the interesting stuff happens, right? This is the stuff you don't know, you don't really know what's going on in the financial flows between non-banks and investors, etc., etc. So one last point on the financial tsunami. I'm going to be very brief. It's something that we talked about only recently. But the key idea that we had is that financial tsunami, the interesting thing is, doesn't really depend only on the domestic monetary policy, but it depends on the realm of the monetary policy over the globe, basically. So the question is, now that we have the big players in the world which have low interest rates, right? The US, Canada, Europe, what's going to happen, as some economists are arguing that you might have overheating of the economy at some point, and maybe some monetary policy instruments are going to lead to detachment from the zero lower bound. And so our question is, how is the capital flows landscape is going to change if you have these new interest rates deltas, let's say, between different countries? And the first idea that we had, this is still very rough, is maybe to have a very minimal model as a sort of network lattice where the countries and therefore the monetary policy on which you have these investors, these people moving capital, and to play a bit on what's going to happen if you have more interest rate on one hand and less somewhere else, and to see if this leads to some cascading effect. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, David's introduce of the two unintended consequences of in our group discussion. So let me talk a little more about the cross-boundary flow. So for this one, actually we are more focused on the Canadian conditions. So here, if you look at this graph, this is about the direct investment, portfolio investment, and other investment asset and liability of Canada. So you can see actually the quantity, the amount of this investment is a huge amount. So if we, kind of like similar with the typical SFC model and ignore the this part of this like foreigner investment, this is it means kind of like we ignore a huge risk, potential risk when we discuss or analyze the problem. And if we zoom in to look at the currency of this investment, you can see here the green color is the United States dollars. So you can see for, especially on the asset side, which is the left picture, you can see the US dollars actually is dominated the foreign investment for Canada. So here, the other one is like have the Japanese one and also UK pound and also euros. But because actually for Canadians, economics is really have a strong relationship with US. No matter we talk about the international trades or we talk about our Canadian short-term interest rate, they always have a strong correlation with United States. So you can see based on this, it's important for us to discuss about the cross-boundary flow in our models. And also, if we zoom into this, this is a portfolio investment. So you can see similarly, for the asset, we also have dominated US dollars, the green color in the pictures. So this is a nearly 2/3 for the asset, Canadian asset, and also about nearly 1/3 for the international investment liabilities. So that's why we think it's important to include this cross-boundary flows. Okay, so here, actually for our workshop, we do several things. For example, we collecting the data and before and also during this pandemic. However, we also know, like, because of the delay of the data publish, especially for the emergency market. So here, for the empirical analysis, actually we has to more focus on the Canada's one. So for the long term, actually we plan to talk a little more about the kind of like the geometric graph of our topics, and also including this data to our agent-based SFC models. And also here we already give many explanation about our fund for this empirical work. And for the our next step, actually we have a short-term and a long-term plan. So for the short-term, it means before the publishing of the economic data, international economic data about this pandemic, we plan to more focus on the Canadian conditions, and we want to talk about, like, use some typical statistic methods to discuss about these 3 unintended problems. And also for the long term, after we get enough data, international data, like maybe until 2021, so we can start to use the agent-based model to talk about the AB-SFC models. So this is our presentation, and thank you for your attention. Yeah, is there any questions or comments?
Thank you very much, Group 3. So like I did for the other groups, I'd like to start by getting reactions and feedback from Ian, who proposed the problem at the start of the workshop. Ian?
Oh my God, I don't know where to start. It's been such a blast. Kyle and I have had a wonderful time the past 3 weeks. So thanks to Matthias, Angus, Alan, William, and the Fields Institute for letting us be part of this. It's just been wonderful. Also, particular thanks to William White, who's my favorite Cassandra, who in common with Wynne Godley forecast the last financial crisis. So it's been amazing having his feedback and insight. I used to teach in a previous life as an academic. I used to teach ordinary differential equations from a book by Oktay, who used to have a quote at the beginning: "We've not succeeded in answering all of our problems. The answers we have found only serve to raise a whole new set of questions. In some ways, we feel we are as confused as ever, but we believe we are confused at a higher level and about more important things." So this 3 weeks has been about raising the level of our confusion, but we feel we've laid out a program of work, a roadmap for work we want to do. Really impressed by this team, diverse skills. We've got people, as you've seen, very strong economists, but also people with a complex systems background, and those skills have complemented, and we've seen there's been a blossoming as we've got to know each other, and I think we'll see more of that if we continue to work together. I've learned so much just getting our hands dirty with the system of national accounts. I know what my new bedtime reading is going to be. I've got to actually send that thing to the printer and read the whole damn thing from beginning to end. A quick shout out of thanks to Stephen Kinsella, who gave us code for an R Shiny web app that implements the 7 unsustainable processes, which we made some progress in implementing that, more on that. And Stop Press, one of his students, Hamid Raza, who wrote one of the SFC models mentioned in the talk, he wrote one about a small open economy and specifically applied to Iceland. And he's agreed to help the team in the weeks ahead. So I must thank my boss, Peter Grant, and Doug Heinemann at the CSTO. We are very happy that, that systemic risk got a mention in the budget 3 days ago. We've been trying to launch a systemic risk regulator for Canada for 12 years. It's high time we got this regulator launched, and it's particularly in a time where shadow banking is so important. In other words, market-based finance. Canada needs a national capital markets regulator. I'll stop there. Fantastic. We've had such a great 3 weeks. If anyone's ever done amateur dramatics when you're in a show, and you do lots of rehearsals, and then the show, and then it's all over, you get a lot of post-production blues. I think all the teams are going to have that. We just had such a good 3 weeks. This format, the workshop format, has been so inspirational. Thanks to all the organizers.
Thank you, Ian, and don't worry about blues. We still have next week. So, yes, thank you, and congratulations to the team again. Reactions from others, comments. I think Bill White has been the constant mentor for this group. Bill, do you have reactions?
You mute yourself. Yeah.
Excuse me. The only point that I would make is that you might want to go back and look a little bit at the issue of overlaps between the various groups, where it struck me at the question of what is the problem that we're trying to address seemed to come up on a number of different occasions. So maybe for the presentation on Monday, one should sort of think about ways in which you could perhaps put some of those things together. You know, one thing that focuses on what is the question, and then afterwards more directly on what are the proposed solutions. But I was going to ask the team, or maybe Ian in particular, I mean, do you feel at the moment a stronger sense of dread about what might be coming down the line? Or do you rather think that your initial investigations have, as it were, been sort of more, two-handed? Like, one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at one of the later charts, you know, in terms of the good news, is that a lot of it seemed to me, the chart seemed consistent with the hypothesis that much of the new mortgage debt was actually being used to pay down consumer debt, which frankly is good news. You know, that it becomes more sustainable. I was also interested in and glad to see that when you look at the cross-currency exposures, that Canadian assets are 2/3 in American dollars, where only 1/3 of the liabilities are in American dollars. Now, a lot of people can still be exposed and still go bankrupt because some people are, what's the word? They're different people that are the creditors and the debtors. But generally speaking, nice to know that it was that way and not some other way around. But anyway, to repeat the question, how do you feel at this early juncture about the systemic exposures of the Canadian economy? Do you feel better now than you did 3 weeks ago, or worse?
Possibly because we're only just scratching the surface. I mean, I'm not always a very good person to talk to, because I listen to many podcasts from Rob Johnson at INET and so on, and he gets really good people on, like Galbraith and so on, and people like Yanis Varoufakis, who really are trying to make the case that global capitalism is quite broken. And an example for that is just the fact that we have all these ETFs and passive management, so that there's nobody sitting on boards of companies anymore. So democracy is quite broken at some level. And in the US, the whole movement over the past few decades away from manufacturing towards just having this massive financial industry. And I'm from the UK, where we've had this catastrophe of Brexit, again, where you've got a very small number of people skewing democracy. So in general, I'm not optimistic, but in terms of the data we've seen so far, I think you made some very good points about how, you know, there's some encouraging things. If you just literally look at the Canadian data, it doesn't look too catastrophic, but I'm sure others have things to say on that.
Are there other answers from the group for that particular question? Because there's another question hanging. I'm not getting answers from the group in addition to what Ian just said, so maybe moving to Thibault.
I'm going to assume then that nobody is alarmed.
So, well, I guess we are a bit alarmed, right? The central bank, I mean, as you guys pointed out, there was this press release a day or two ago where this Bank of Canada decided to start reducing the rate at which they do QE. And you highlighted indeed quite a few keywords of expectations, household debt, or housing price. So yes, those issues are very much interesting to us. And actually, I wanted to reiterate one of the questions you guys asked, to which I don't myself have an answer, like how much debt is too much debt? And depending on what's the type of debt and where it goes, who holds it, and if it is indeed too much debt, then what should we do about it? I mean, the answer to those two questions is far from being obvious to me and to quite a few of my colleagues. I mean, I try to answer those, and I don't have an answer. So if you guys can come up with an answer, great, let us know.
So mine should, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Davide.
Mine is not an answer, but it was a reflection. And as long as you can sustain your debt with the inflation rates, which are good enough, right? That sort of takes away the amount of the debt, right? So you can repay also for your interest. So that from a macro level, being on a good pace in the economy helps also the micro level, because you can repay your debt in an easier way, right? Which I guess is one of the arguments when it comes also to government debt as well. Yeah, this was just not an answer, I understand, but just a quick thought.
Yeah, so it points in the direction of looking at the debt servicing ratio, where you can see that it's pretty much flat. I mean, you have more debt, but then the rates have been decreasing. So the debt servicing, what you pay every month, may not be increasing that much. But then, I mean, is that a new steady state? Or if you expect rates to go up at some point, if you believe that the neutral rate is higher than zeros, then that's scope for future problems, possibly.
But if you look at that, actually, I think I looked at it a while ago, was the debt services ratio are pretty much steady, but the part you pay on interest are, of course, decreasing because mortgage interest rates are really low. So the question is, what's going to happen if they start increasing again, right? That's a new regime, right? It doesn't really, I don't think it's mapped to one-to-one.
Yeah, and also, by the way, actually, if like before this 3 weeks, actually, I know like Canadian have a strong correlation with the US, but actually after we look at the cross investment and also about interest rate, if you compare the Canadian one with the United States one, you'll find actually it's like more than 90% correlation between these two countries. So similar as David said, like although now like our interest rate is stay at low numbers, but we know like United States, they already have a COVID stimulus, a huge one. And if in future, like the increase in their interest rate from what we saw from the historical data, Canadian one short-term interest will of course increase. And this will actually kind of like what will happen for Canadian in future. Sometimes it's not decided by Canadian government. And also, if you look at the foreigner investment, you also see like it's dominated by the US dollars. So I think this is also like the number of the debt and the investment is important, but the diverse or the percentage of the investment is also important. I feel.
I just want to say this whole question of whether or not debt is sustainable or not is one reason for looking at the SFC models. And Mateus's own research is great because seeing the economy as a dynamical system, you can then ask the question, what type of equilibria exist? There's good ones and bad ones. And we had a slide where I borrowed some diagrams from one of his papers showing that there can be good outcomes and there can be unstable equilibria at the boundary, which are basically catastrophic. And most economists don't tend to think about the catastrophic outcomes. They just think about the nice equilibrium, and everything heads back towards that. They don't consider that a possibility that things can go very badly wrong if you're not careful.
Yeah. Thank you for that plug into my work here, and then I will resist the temptation to comment on that. And I'll just ask Alan for one last question for this group, and then we move to the next group. You're muted, Alan, sorry.
There, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now I wanted a little bit to respond to Bill, and I think ever since the financial crisis, everybody has sort of been saying, well, the next one's going to happen, you know, there's going to be another bad one. And so that was very different from how it was before 2008. But recently, it seems with the way the financial markets have gone, that sort of discourse has gone away. And I think nothing is more alarming than to have no alarm around. Because I remember in 2007, Bert Malkiel, the well-known Princeton economist, he said, there's one thing you can be absolutely sure of, that the idea that we could have a financial collapse based on a problem with the derivative markets should not be on the top of anybody's worry list. Now that was 2007 late, and you know what happened afterwards. So my suspicion is that, you know, when people stop worrying and stop being alarmed, that's when you should be worried. Yep. So that's sort of paradoxical, but I think that that's the way things are. You know, it's just that we're not very good at anticipating things. And just to on your last comment, the idea that we sort of look out for the bad equilibrium, I'm not sure that this word equilibrium should be used, because we move through this space, you know, we're never in an equilibrium in the usual sense. We're always moving from one state to another. And I think we spend much too much time thinking about, is this a good equilibrium or not, when it's probably not an equilibrium at all.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And when you go back to the Minsky stuff, I mean, the basic element that distinguishes it from all the other, you know, neoclassical kind of stuff is there is no equilibrium. Mm-hmm. Just does what it does.
Right, and I should say that dynamical systems approach allows for that, for this situation of limit cycles and also strange attractors and all sorts of repelling regions where you never really approach an equilibrium. That's really part of the framework. But